The sun hung low over the red rocks, painting the desert in shades of rust and gold. A lone figure moved through the dust-choked main street of Silver Creek, a mining town that had sprung up like a weed in the harsh Nevada territory. The woman kept her left arm close to her body, hidden beneath layers of worn fabric despite the oppressive heat. Margaret Quinn had learned to walk without drawing attention, not too fast to seem desperate, not too slow to appear lost. Her boots clicked against the wooden planks of the sidewalk, each step measured and deliberate. The town stretched before her, a collection of false-fronted buildings, their paint peeling in the dry air. Saloons already beginning their nightly chorus of piano music and rough laughter. She caught the eyes following her progress. A woman alone in a mining town was either looking for work in the saloons or running from something. Margaret was neither, and both. The whispers started before she'd made it halfway down the street. "Ain't seen her before," muttered a miner, his face still bearing the dust of the day's labor. "Traveling alone, too," his companion added, spitting tobacco juice into the street. "That ain't natural." Margaret kept her gaze forward, focusing on the general store at the end of the street. She needed supplies, flour, salt, maybe some dried beans if the price was fair. Her money was running low. Had been for weeks now, but she'd learned to make a dollar stretch like leather in the sun. The bell above the door jangled as she entered the store. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes, watched her from behind the counter. She moved through the narrow aisles, selecting items carefully, aware of how the other customers gave her a wide berth. "That'll be $2.30, the proprietor said when she approached the counter. His eyes lingered on her covered arm. Margaret counted out the coins slowly, her right hand steady despite the tremor she felt inside. As she reached for her purchases, a sack of flour tumbled from the pile, bursting open on the floor in a white cloud. "Land sakes," she muttered, dropping to her knees to salvage what she could. The proprietor came around the counter, grumbling about waste and carelessness. "Let me help you with that, ma'am." The voice was deep, weathered like old leather. Margaret looked up to see a man crouched beside her, his large hands already scooping flour back into what remained of the sack. He was older, perhaps 50, with silver threading through dark hair and lines carved deep around eyes the color of prairie sky. His clothes marked him as a rancher, worn but clean, practical rather than showy. "I can manage," Margaret said. But he was already transferring the salvaged flour into a new sack he'd grabbed from the counter. "Jacob Walsh," he said simply, not looking for a handshake that wouldn't come. "Got a ranch about 15 miles north of here. In town for supplies myself." Margaret nodded, offering nothing in return. She'd learned that names could be traced, stories could be verified. Better to remain a ghost. Jacob helped her to her feet, his movement careful, as if she might spook like an unbroken horse. He had the calm way about him that men who worked with animals often developed, patient, observant, slow to sudden movements. "Storm's coming," he said, glancing toward the window where the sky had begun to darken. "Can smell it on the wind? Big one, by the look of those clouds." Margaret followed his gaze. Black clouds were building on the horizon, the kind that brought walls of dust that could strip skin from bone. She'd been caught in sandstorms before, knew the terror of being unable to see your hand in front of your face, the grit filling your mouth and nose until breathing became a battle. "Best find shelter soon." Jacob continued. "These desert storms don't give much warning." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "My wagon's outside. Got room if you need a place to wait it out. Ranch has a solid house, built to weather worse than this." It was kindly offered, without the edge of expectation she'd learned to listen for in men's voices. Still, Margaret hesitated. Kindness often came with a price, and she had little left to pay. The first gust of wind rattled the store windows, carrying the sharp scent of rain and earth. Outside, horses began to whinny nervously, and folks hurried to secure loose items. The storm was moving fast. "I don't," Margaret began, then stopped. Where would she go? The boarding houses would ask questions, want references. The saloons would assume she was there for work of a different kind. And the storm, she could already see the wall of dust approaching. A brown mountain eating the sky. "No obligation, ma'am," Jacob said, already moving toward the door. "But that storm won't wait for us to make up our minds." The wind hit with sudden force as they stepped outside, nearly knocking Margaret sideways. Jacob steadied her with a gentle hand on her elbow, her right elbow. She noticed, as if he'd somehow sensed her need to protect the left side. His wagon sat waiting, loaded with supplies and covered with a thick canvas tarp. The horses stamped nervously, ears flat against their heads. "Up you go," Jacob said, helping her onto the bench seat before climbing up himself. He released the brake and snapped the reins, urging the horses into motion just as the first wave of dust rolled over the town. Margaret pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth, squinting against the stinging sand beside her. Jacob drove with the confidence of a man who'd traveled this road countless times, his body moving with the wagon's rhythm. The world narrowed to the few feet visible ahead, everything else lost in a howling brown void. They rode in silence, broken only by the storm's fury and the creak of wagon wheels. Margaret kept her left arm pressed tight against her body, even though the thick dust made it impossible for Jacob to see anything clearly. Old habits died hard, and some wounds never stopped aching. Time lost meaning in the storm. It might have been minutes or hours before Jacob turned the horses off the main road, following some landmark only he could see. The wind seemed to lessen slightly, blocked by rises in the land. And then, through the swirling dust, she saw it, a cluster of buildings huddled against the storm like cattle bunched for warmth. The ranch house was solid, built from timber and stone, with a porch that wrapped around two sides. Jacob pulled the wagon close to the barn, jumping down to lead the horses inside. Margaret followed, grateful for the sudden cessation of wind when the barn doors closed behind them. "House is just across the yard," Jacob said, working quickly to unhitch the horses. "Go on inside. Door's not locked. I'll see to the animals and be along." Margaret hesitated. Entering a strange man's house alone violated every rule of propriety, but propriety seemed a small concern against the storm's rage. She pulled her shawl tight and made the dash across the yard, the wind trying to tear her from her feet. The house was dark and cool inside, filled with the comfortable smell of wood smoke and coffee. Margaret stood just inside the door, unsure whether to light a lamp or wait. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out the simple furnishings, a table and chairs, a rocking chair by the cold fireplace, shelves lined with books. It was a man's space, but clean, organized with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to take care of himself. Jacob entered a few minutes later, shaking dust from his hat. "I'll get a fire going," he said, moving to the fireplace with practiced ease. "Coffee's in the pot on the stove. Might still be warm from this morning." Margaret found cups and poured coffee that was indeed lukewarm but welcome. She watched Jacob work, noting the careful way he moved, the slight stiffness in his left knee, a man who'd lived a hard life but hadn't let it make him hard in return. "Thank you," she said finally, offering him a cup. He accepted it with a nod, settling into a chair with a soft grunt. "Storm like this killed my wife," he said quietly, staring into the growing flames. 8 years ago come October, she was coming back from town, got caught in the open, found her the next day." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with old grief. Margaret understood offering pain as a gift. "Here is my wound, you need not show me yours," but understanding didn't make it easier to accept. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. Jacob shrugged, the movement speaking volumes about acceptance and endurance. Life out here takes as much as it gives, maybe more. He glanced at her, then away. "You running from something or towards something? Does it matter?" "Not particularly. Just making conversation while we wait out the weather." They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged outside. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Margaret found herself relaxing incrementally, her shoulders dropping from their defensive hunch. There was something about this man, this place, that didn't demand anything from her. It was a strange feeling, like setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its presence. "I've got a spare room," Jacob said eventually. "Nothing fancy, but the roof don't leak and the bed's comfortable enough. You're welcome to it until the storm passes." Margaret knew she should refuse, make excuses, keep moving, but the storm showed no signs of abating, and she was so tired, tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of measuring every word and gesture. Tomorrow she could be cautious again. Tonight, perhaps, she could simply be, "Thank you," she said again, the words carrying more weight this time. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. "You're welcome, Miss—" She hesitated for just a moment. "Margaret," she said finally, offering her first name like a tentative gift. "Well then, Margaret," Jacob said, raising his coffee cup in a small salute. "Welcome to the Walsh Ranch, such as it is." Outside, the storm continued its assault on the desert, but inside the sturdy house, two strangers sat by a fire, sharing silence and space, each nursing wounds the other couldn't see. It wasn't peace, exactly, but it was a respite. And in the harsh landscape of the frontier, sometimes that was miracle enough. As the evening deepened and the fire burned low, Margaret allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what it might be like to stop running. The thought terrified her almost as much as the secrets she carried, hidden beneath fabric and silence on her left arm. But here, in this simple house with this quiet man, the terror seemed distant, held at bay by firelight and unexpected kindness. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The storm would pass, the road would call, and she would have to decide whether to trust this fragile moment of safety. But tonight, she was warm and dry, and that was enough. The wind howled around the corners of the house like a living thing, but inside, all was still. The moon hung like a silver dollar over the dried grassland, casting long shadows from the fence posts that marched in straight lines toward the horizon. Margaret stood on the porch, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the coyotes call to each other across the valley. She'd been at the Walsh Ranch for 3 days now, the storm having passed but leaving the roads treacherous with washouts and debris. Jacob emerged from the barn, his silhouette familiar now in the way that surprised her. She'd learned his routines, up before dawn to tend the horses, coffee on the stove by the time the sun crested the hills, evening hours spent mending tack or reading by lamplight. A quiet life, but one with its own rhythms and purposes. "Beautiful night," he said, climbing the porch steps with the careful gait she now knew came from an old injury. A horse had rolled on him years back. He'd mentioned in passing, leaving him with a knee that predicted weather better than any almanac. Peaceful, Margaret agreed, though peace was still a foreign concept to her. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for questions that would probe too deep, for demands that would send her running again. Jacob settled into the other rocking chair, the wood creaking under his weight. They'd fallen into this pattern, evening conversations that meandered like creek water, never pushing too hard against the banks of privacy. "Lost my son out there," Jacob said suddenly, nodding toward the western range. "Not dead," he added quickly, perhaps seeing something in her posture. "Just lost to me. Thomas, he'd be about 30 now, I reckon." Margaret waited. She'd learned that Jacob's stories came in their own time, pulled from him by moon and memory rather than questions. He wanted more than this place could give him. Jacob continued. "Fought me on everything. How to run the ranch, how to break horses, how to live. Day he turned 18. He lit out for California. Haven't heard from him since. That must be hard," Margaret offered carefully. Jacob's laugh was dry as desert wind. "Sarah, my wife, she used to say I drove him off with my stubbornness. Maybe she was right. I wanted him to love this land like I did. Couldn't understand why he'd want to leave." He paused, fingers drumming on the chair arm. "After Sarah died, I thought maybe he'd come back. Foolish notion." They sat in silence, listening to the night sounds. Somewhere in the distance, a barn owl called, the sound both mournful and beautiful. "You never said where you're headed," Jacob ventured, his tone making it clear this was an observation, not a demand. "West," Margaret said simply. It was true enough. She always moved west, as if the setting sun might finally swallow her past. "Lot of west out there," Jacob mused, "though I suppose that's the point." A horse whinnied in the corral, and another answered. The sound drew Margaret's attention to the animals, their shapes dark against the star-filled sky. "I could use help around here," Jacob said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if they'd surprised him. "If you were inclined to stay a while, nothing improper," he added hastily. "You'd have your room, wages fair for the work, it's a big place for one person." Margaret's hand went instinctively to her left arm, hidden as always beneath long sleeves. "I don't know if—" "No need to answer tonight," Jacob interrupted gently. "Just something to consider. Work's honest, cooking, helping with the horses, maybe some mending. You seem to have a way with the animals." It was true. The horses had taken to her, perhaps recognizing a fellow wounded creature. She'd helped Jacob with feeding and grooming, careful to keep her left side always turned away, and found unexpected comfort in their simple needs and affections. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Jacob nodded, satisfied. They returned to their comfortable silence, but Margaret's mind was churning. Stay? The very idea went against every instinct that had kept her alive and free these past years. Yet something about this place, this man, made her want to try. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. Both Margaret and Jacob tensed, years of frontier living having taught them that speed rarely brought good news. As the rider drew closer, Jacob relaxed slightly. "That's Bill Martinez from town," he said, rising to meet the man. Bill pulled up hard, his horse lathered with sweat. "Jacob," he gasped. "Thought you should know. Group of men came through town today, asking questions. Rough bunch, wearing matched dusters. They're looking for someone." Margaret's blood turned to ice. She forced herself to remain still, to breathe normally, even as every fiber of her being screamed to run. "Looking for who?" Jacob asked calmly. "A woman," Bill said, glancing at Margaret with curiosity. "Said she's a runaway, belongs to them. Showed a paper, but Sheriff Daniels wasn't buying it. Told them we don't hold with that business here, whatever they claimed. Good for Daniels," Jacob said. "These men say where they were headed?" "North, toward the mining camps. But Jacob—" Bill hesitated, then forged ahead. "They had a running iron with them. Saw it myself, strapped to one of their saddles." A running iron, a tool for altering brands on stolen cattle, or for marking human property in ways that violated every principle of human dignity. Margaret's left arm throbbed with phantom pain, the old scar seeming to burn anew. "I appreciate you riding out, Bill," Jacob said, his voice steady as granite. "You best get back before full dark." After Bill left, Jacob turned to Margaret. She stood frozen on the porch, her coffee cup gripped so tightly her knuckles were white. "Those men looking for you?" he asked quietly. Margaret couldn't speak, couldn't move. The past she'd been running from had found her again, as it always did. She should leave now, tonight, before she brought trouble to this kind man's door. "Margaret?" Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "Are those men looking for you?" She managed a nod, her throat too tight for words. Jacob was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the moonlight. Then he did something that surprised her. He went back to his chair and sat down, rocking slowly. "Well," he said finally, "good thing they're headed north. Gives us time to prepare." "Prepare?" Margaret's voice came out as a croak. "I should leave. Tonight. I won't bring trouble to—" "You won't bring anything I can't handle." Jacob interrupted. "Been dealing with trouble of one kind or another my whole life. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I already offered you a job. Be bad manners to run off a new employee." Margaret sank back into her chair, overwhelmed. "You don't understand. These men, what they did, what they—" She stopped, unable to voice the horrors that lived in her memory. Don't need to understand everything to know wrong from right. Jacob said simply, You're a free woman, Margaret. Whatever paper they showed, whatever claim they think they have, it doesn't matter here. Not on my land. Tears burned her eyes, but she blinked them back. She'd learned not to cry, learned that tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. But this unexpected championship, this matter-of-fact acceptance, threatened to undo all her careful control. There's something else you should know, she began, but Jacob held up a hand. Whatever you want to tell me, whenever you're ready, I'll listen, he said. But you don't owe me your secrets. Margaret, we all got things we carry, some in our hearts, some on our bodies. Doesn't change who we are right now, in this moment. A coyote howled again, closer this time, and its pack answered in a wild chorus. The sound should have been eerie, but tonight it seemed almost protective, as if the land itself was stating its position. If I stay, Margaret said slowly, they might come here. Might, Jacob agreed. Then again, might not. Can't live our lives on might. They sat together as the moon traced its path across the sky. Two wounded souls finding unexpected comfort in shared silence. The night wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Margaret made her decision somewhere between one heartbeat and the next, a choice that went against every instinct except the newest one, the tiny, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place to stop running. About that job, she said finally. Jacob's smile was visible even in the darkness. Starts tomorrow. Coffee's at dawn. Breakfast after we see to the horses. Pays $20 a month plus room and board. That's generous. That's fair, he corrected. This place needs more than I can give it alone. Has for a long time. Margaret nodded, sealing the bargain. Tomorrow she would begin a new role. Neither fleeing nor hiding, but working. Contributing. Perhaps even belonging. The thought terrified and thrilled her in equal measure, as if sensing the shift in the air. Jacob stood and stretched. Best get some rest. Dawn comes early, and those horses won't feed themselves. He paused at the door, looking back at her. Margaret, whatever comes, we'll face it. You're not alone anymore. The words hung in the air after he went inside, a promise and a challenge. Margaret remained on the porch, watching the stars wheel overhead, feeling the weight of her secret burn beneath the fabric of her sleeve. Soon, she knew, she would have to reveal it. But not tonight. Tonight, she would simply be Margaret, newly hired hand at the Walsh Ranch, with a bed to sleep in and work to do come morning. The coyotes sang again, and this time, their wild music sounded like welcome home. The morning sun painted the grassland gold, and Margaret moved among the horses with a confidence that had grown over the past 2 weeks. She carried a bucket of oats, speaking softly to each animal as she went. The mare she'd named Buttercup, though Jacob laughed at the sentimental choice, nickered and pressed her velvet nose into Margaret's shoulder. Greedy thing, Margaret murmured, but her tone was affectionate. She'd discovered an unexpected gift with the horses, a natural understanding that seemed to flow both ways. They didn't care about her past or the secrets she carried. They responded only to her gentle hands and quiet voice. Jacob watched from the barn door, mending a bridle. It had become their morning ritual. She with the horses, he with whatever needed fixing. They worked in companionable rhythm, occasionally sharing observations about the weather or the animal's health. That mare's taken a real shine to you, Jacob called out. She knows I'm the one with the oats, Margaret replied, but she was smiling. The work suited her. After years of running, of making herself small and invisible, there was something healing about having purpose, routine, contribution. She'd taken over the cooking entirely, discovering that Jacob had been living on beans and burnt coffee for longer than was healthy. Her biscuits, light and golden, had earned genuine praise. I'm riding to check the north pasture fence, Jacob announced, hanging the mended bridle on a peg. Want to come along? You could use the practice. Margaret had been learning to ride properly, not just to flee, but to work cattle and cover ground efficiently. Jacob was a patient teacher, never pushing when she showed reluctance about mounting from the left side, always finding ways to accommodate her need to protect that arm. "I should get started on the mending," she said, gesturing toward the pile of torn shirts and trousers that seemed to reproduce overnight. "Mending'll keep. Beautiful day won't." It was true. The October sky was crystalline blue, the heat of summer finally breaking into the crisp clarity of autumn. Margaret found herself nodding, surprising them both. They saddled 2 horses, Margaret choosing the gentle gelding Jacob had suggested for her lessons. She'd grown comfortable with the ritual, checking the girth, adjusting stirrups, all performed one-handed while her left arm remained pressed to her side. If Jacob noticed her awkwardness, he never commented. They rode out across the grassland, the horses' hooves crushing dry grass and releasing its sweet scent. Jacob pointed out landmarks, the lightning-struck cottonwood that marked the property line, the draw where water collected after storms, the rocky outcrop where rattlesnakes sunned themselves. "This land speaks, if you know how to listen," he said, reining in atop a small rise. The ranch spread below them, buildings tiny in the vast landscape. Every valley and ridge has a story. Sarah used to say I loved the land more than I loved her. "Did you?" Margaret asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Jacob only smiled, a sad, gentle expression. "Maybe, but I loved her too. In my way. Just wasn't good at showing it. Better with horses than people," she'd say. They continued north, checking fence posts and looking for breaks in the wire. The work was tedious but necessary. Cattle had a talent for finding any weakness and exploiting it. As they rode, Jacob shared stories of the ranch's history, how he'd claimed the land 20 years ago when it was truly wild, built it up through drought and plenty. "Thomas helped me dig the well," he said, pointing to the windmill that turned lazily in the distance. "Boy was 12. Complained the whole time about blisters and heat. But when we hit water—" Jacob's voice trailed off, lost in memory. Margaret had learned to read his silences, to understand that grief came in waves, even years after loss. She waited, letting him find his way back. "Sorry," he said finally. "Don't mean to go on about the past." "Don't apologize. It's your history. It matters." They were approaching a section where the fence dipped into a narrow canyon. Jacob dismounted to examine a post that listed at an angle, and Margaret followed suit. As they worked to shore up the post, she reached without thinking, using both hands to hold the wire taut. Her sleeve pulled back, revealing just a glimpse of scarred skin. She jerked away immediately, pulling the fabric down, but it was too late. Jacob had seen. Their eyes met across the fence line, and Margaret waited for the questions, the disgust, the assumptions she'd faced before when others had glimpsed her mark. Instead, Jacob simply said, "Hold this steady while I hammer." They finished the repair in silence, but it was a different quality of quiet than before. Margaret could feel something shifting between them, unspoken understanding deepening into something more profound. When they mounted up again, Jacob surprised her. "My father was a hard man," he said, guiding his horse along the fence line. "Believed in marking what was his, cattle, horses, land, even people, in his way. Not with iron, but with words and fists. Took me years to understand that marking something doesn't make it yours, just makes it wounded." Margaret's throat tightened. She managed to say, "Some wounds don't heal." "No," Jacob agreed. "But they can become part of who we are, not all of who we are, if we let them." They were climbing now, following a deer trail up the side of the canyon. At the top, Jacob reined in again, and Margaret gasped. The view stretched for miles, golden grass rolling like an ocean, mountains purple in the distance, the ribbon of creek glinting silver where it wound through the valley. "This is why I stay," Jacob said simply. "This is what I wanted Thomas to see, to feel, the way the land holds you, roots you, makes you part of something bigger than your own troubles." Margaret understood. sitting there on horseback, feeling the sun on her face and the vast openness all around. She felt something inside her unclenching, loosening. For so long she'd made herself small, tried to disappear, but this land demanded presence, demanded you match its scale or be diminished. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It's home," Jacob corrected. Then, softer, "Could be yours too, if you wanted." The words hung between them, weighted with possibility. Margaret knew he wasn't just talking about employment anymore. In these weeks of working side by side, sharing meals and silences, something had grown between them. Not passion, perhaps, but understanding, respect, the tentative beginnings of trust. "I don't know if I know how to have a home," she admitted. "Neither did I. When I first came here, Lan taught me, Sarah taught me." He paused. "Maybe you could teach me something too." They started back as the afternoon shadows lengthened. Margaret felt raw, exposed, as if that glimpse of scar had peeled back more than sleeve. But she also felt something else, a tentative hope, fragile as spring grass but just as persistent. As they neared the ranch, she saw a rider approaching from the south. Her body tensed automatically, but Jacob laid a calming hand on his horse's neck. "That's just Sam Wilson from the Double Bar, neighbor to the south. Good man." Sam was indeed friendly, tipping his hat to Margaret and sharing news about cattle prices and weather predictions. But as he prepared to leave, his expression grew serious. "Jake, thought you should know. Those fellows asking questions in town? They were at my place yesterday. Showed me a paper, said they were looking for stolen property. I told them I hadn't seen any stolen horses or cattle. What did they say to that?" Jacob asked carefully. Sam's weathered face creased in disgust. "Said they weren't looking for animals. I told them the only property I recognize has 4 legs and a brand I can read. They didn't take kindly to that." After Sam left, Margaret and Jacob finished the ride in thoughtful silence. Back at the barn, as they unsaddled the horses, she found herself speaking. "They'll come here eventually." "Likely," Jacob agreed, hanging his saddle on its stand. "I won't let them hurt you." Jacob turned to face her fully. "Margaret, I've been taking care of myself for 50 years. I don't need protecting. But maybe we could take care of each other." The simplicity of it, the offer of partnership without demand or expectation, nearly undid her. She'd been alone so long, carried her burden in silence, wrapped her wounds in solitude. The possibility of sharing that weight was terrifying and tempting in equal measure. "I'll think about it," she managed. That night, as she served dinner, venison stew and fresh bread, the domestic normalcy of it all struck her forcefully. 2 weeks ago, she'd been a ghost drifting through the desert. Now she had work that mattered, a roof that didn't leak, and a man who saw her scars, literally now, and didn't flinch. "Good stew," Jacob said, mopping his bowl with bread. "Secret's in browning the meat first," she replied automatically, then smiled at how ordinary it sounded. They did the dishes together, another routine that had developed naturally. As Margaret dried the last plate, she made a decision. Not about everything, she wasn't ready for that, but about this moment, this day, this small step toward trust. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "I'd like to tell you about how I came to be marked. If you're willing to listen." Jacob's hands stilled in the soapy water. "I'll listen to whatever you want to share, whenever you're ready to share it." "Tomorrow," she repeated, needing to commit before courage failed. That night, Margaret lay in her bed listening to the familiar sounds, wind in the eaves, horses shifting in the corral, the distant yip of coyotes. But tonight there was something new in the symphony, the sound of her own breathing, steady and unafraid. Tomorrow would bring revelations, possibly danger, certainly change, but tonight she was safe. Tonight she was home. The moon rose over the grassland, silver light flooding through her window, and Margaret Quinn allowed herself to believe, just for a moment, that some wounds really could become just part of the story, not the entire tale. The nightmare came as it always did, in fragments of heat and pain. The smell of burning metal, rough hands holding her down, the searing agony as the iron touched skin. Margaret woke gasping. Her left arm clutched against her chest, phantom pain shooting through the old scar. Gray dawn light filtered through the window. She'd promised Jacob. Today. The thought made her stomach clench, but she'd learned that broken promises hurt worse than kept ones. She dressed carefully, as always, the long-sleeved dress covering her arms completely. In the kitchen, she started coffee and began mixing biscuit dough, finding comfort in the familiar routine. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, but the rhythm of cooking steadied her. Jacob appeared as the coffee finished brewing, his hair still damp from washing. "Morning," he said, accepting the cup she offered. His eyes searched her face, reading the tension there, but he didn't push. They ate breakfast quietly, the only sounds the clink of forks on plates and the morning birds outside. Margaret barely tasted the food, her mind already racing ahead to the conversation that awaited. "I'll see to the horses," Jacob said when they finished, but Margaret shook her head. Could we talk first, while I still have the courage?" Jacob set down his coffee cup and folded his hands on the table. "I'm listening." Margaret stared at her own hands, unable to meet his eyes. Where to begin? How to explain something that still made no sense to her, even after living through it? "I was 19, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Living with my aunt in Missouri after my parents died of fever. She arranged a marriage for me. A man named Charles Dutton, who owned a trading post. Said I was lucky, that he was prosperous." She paused, remembering the girl she'd been, frightened but obedient, believing that marriage meant safety, security. How wrong she'd been. Charles wasn't what he seemed. The trading post was a front. He was involved with a group that... She swallowed hard. "That dealt in human misery. They took people, Indians from their lands, Mexicans from across the border, sometimes white women who had no family to search for them, sold them to mining operations, private ranches, places where law didn't reach." Jacob's face had gone still, but he remained silent, letting her find her way through the story. "I tried to leave when I learned the truth. Charles caught me at the stage station, dragged me back. Said I was his property now, legal married, and he'd teach me what happened to property that tried to run." Margaret's voice had gone flat, reciting facts like items on a list. It was the only way she could tell it. "He kept me locked up for weeks. Then one night, he came with 3 other men. They were drunk, laughing, said they were going to make sure I never forgot who I belonged to." Her left hand moved involuntarily to her right arm, covering the place where the scar lay hidden beneath fabric. They heated the iron in the fireplace, the same one they used on the people they sold. Charles held me down while another man, Luther, his name was Luther, pressed it into my skin, just above the elbow, where it would always show if I tried to wear anything decent. The memory of the pain washed over her, and she shuddered. But worse than the pain had been the laughter, the casual way they'd marked her like livestock. The wound got infected. I nearly died. Might have been better if I had, but Charles needed me alive, said I was good for business, made the other prisoners more cooperative to see a white woman branded too. She laughed bitterly. His one mistake was letting me help tend the others. That's where I learned to shoot, to ride, to survive, from a Comanche woman named Mary and a Mexican vaquero called Diego. "How did you escape?" Jacob asked quietly. "There was a raid. Law finally caught wind of the operation, came in shooting. In the confusion, I got to Charles's gun. She paused, then forced herself to continue. "I shot him and Luther both. Took a horse and whatever money I could find and ran. Been running ever since. That was 6 years ago." The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Margaret finally raised her eyes to Jacob's face, bracing for what she might see there. Disgust, pity, disbelief. Instead, she found tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. "Margaret," he said, voice rough. "I'm so sorry. No one has the right. The men looking for me." She continued, needing to finish it all. They're the rest of Charles's gang. They scattered after the raid, but they blame me for bringing the law down on them. And I suppose— She took a shaky breath. I suppose they think I still belong to them. Property to be reclaimed. Jacob stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. For a moment, Margaret thought he was leaving. Couldn't bear to be near her now that he knew, but he only moved to the window, staring out at the dawning day. My father, he said finally, used to say a man's worth was measured by what he owned. Land, cattle, people who owed him. Took me years to understand he was wrong. A man's worth, a person's worth, comes from what they survive, what they build, who they choose to be despite what's been done to them. He turned back to her, and his eyes were fierce with a protective anger that took her breath away. You're the strongest person I've ever met, Margaret Quinn. And those men, if they come here, they'll find out what happens when they try to treat people like property on my land. The tears came then, tears she'd held back for 6 years, great, gulping sobs that shook her whole body. Jacob crossed to her in 2 strides, gathering her carefully into his arms, mindful of her injured arm, even in comfort. It's all right, he murmured into her hair. You're safe, you're free, you're home, she cried until she was empty, wrung out like wet laundry. When the storm passed, she found herself sitting at the table again, a fresh cup of coffee in her hands, and Jacob's handkerchief clutched in her fingers. Show me, he said gently. If you're willing, I'd like to see what they did, to know what we're fighting. With trembling fingers, Margaret unbuttoned her left sleeve and rolled it up past the elbow. The scar was uglier than she remembered, having avoided looking at it for so long. The brand was crude, 3 letters burned deep. CDT, Charles Dutton's territory. Jacob studied it with the same careful attention he gave to wounded animals, then surprised her by tracing one finger gently along the raised edges. This isn't who you are, he said firmly. This is just something that was done to you. Like my bad knee, like the scar on my hand from barbed wire, battle wounds, nothing more. It's ugly, Margaret whispered. It's proof you survived, he corrected. That's beautiful to me. The moment stretched between them, charged with a new understanding. Then Jacob stood, rolling her sleeve back down with careful hands. Now then, he said, voice turning practical. We need to prepare. These men will come, and when they do, they'll find things have changed. Sam Wilson's a good man, and his brother's the federal marshal in Tucson. The Hendersons to the east have 7 sons, all handy with rifles. Sheriff Daniels already showed he's got no patience for slavers. I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm telling, this is my land, my choice, our choice. He corrected. You're not alone anymore. Remember? They spent the morning continuing their normal routines, but with a new awareness. Jacob cleaned and oiled his rifles, checked ammunition. Margaret went about her chores, but noticed how he positioned himself to always keep her in sight, protective without being overbearing. That afternoon, riders appeared on the horizon. Margaret's heart leaped to her throat, but Jacob laid a calming hand on her shoulder. That's the Wilson boys, he said. Told you Sam was a good man. Indeed, Sam Wilson rode up with 2 of his sons, all armed but casual about it. Jake, Sam nodded. Boys and I thought we'd ride fence for a few days, check for strays. Funny thing, seems like all our strays might be up in your north pasture. Might take all 5 of us to round them up. Margaret understood. The neighbors were creating a protective screen, watching without making it obvious. The frontier took care of its own, and she was part of that now. Appreciate the help, Jacob said simply. Coffee's always on if you need warming. As the Wilsons rode off, Margaret felt something shift inside her chest. For 6 years she'd been isolated, marked, alone. Now she had allies, friends, a community that would stand with her. The brand on her arm still ached sometimes, but its power over her was fading. Thank you, she said to Jacob. For what? For seeing me. Not the mark, not the past, me. Jacob smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features. That's the only thing worth seeing, far as I'm concerned. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Margaret felt herself breathing easier than she had in years. The men hunting her would come. She had no illusions about that, but when they did, they'd find Margaret Quinn was no longer running. She had something to stand for now, someone to stand with. The coyotes sang their nightly chorus, and she listened with new ears. Not a lament, but a declaration. This is our territory. We belong here. Come if you dare. The strangers arrived in Silver Creek on a Tuesday afternoon, their matched dusters pale with trail dust, their horses showing hard use. Margaret saw them from the general store window where she'd gone for supplies, and her blood turned to ice water in her veins. 4 men, just as before. The leader, a lean man with dead eyes and a scar that pulled his mouth into a permanent sneer, she recognized as Cole Harwick, Charles's right hand, the one who'd held her arms while Luther heated the iron. The others were younger, hungrier, the kind of men who lived for violence and the promise of easy money. Margaret's hand went instinctively to her left arm, fingers pressing against the fabric that hid her shame. She forced herself to breathe, to think. Jacob was back at the ranch, unaware that death had ridden into town. The Wilson boys were watching the north pasture, too far to help quickly. She was alone, but alone was what she'd been for 6 years. Alone had kept her alive. She moved carefully to the back of the store, catching the proprietor's eye. Mr. Henderson had been friendly these past weeks, and now she saw recognition dawn on his face as he glanced between her and the men visible through the window. "Those the ones been asking about?" he murmured. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. "You go on out the back," Henderson said, already reaching under his counter for the scattergun he kept there. "I'll send my boy to fetch the sheriff." But even as Margaret slipped toward the rear door, she heard boots on the boardwalk, spurs jingling with each step. Too late. The bell chimed as the door opened, and Cole Harwick's voice slithered through the store like oil. "Afternoon. Shopkeep. Looking for someone. Woman about 25. Dark hair. Pretty thing if you don't mind damaged goods." "Can't say I've seen anyone like that," Henderson replied evenly. Margaret pressed herself against the shelves, heart hammering, through a gap in the goods. She could see Cole's reflection in the window glass. He was smiling, the expression making his scar twist grotesquely. "Now that's interesting," Cole drawled. "Because we tracked her to this very town, and unless she sprouted wings, she's still here somewhere. You wouldn't be lying to me, would you?" "I don't know you, mister," Henderson said, steel creeping into his voice. "And I don't take kindly to being called a liar in my own store." One of the younger men laughed, an ugly sound. "Maybe we should ask around more personal-like. Start with that pretty little missus of yours we saw at the schoolhouse." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Margaret closed her eyes, knowing what she had to do. These men would hurt anyone who stood between them and their quarry. She couldn't let others suffer for her. But as she stepped out from behind the shelves, the store's back door burst open. Sheriff Daniels entered, flanked by 2 deputies, all with guns drawn. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Daniels said pleasantly. "Heard you were asking about a woman. Want to tell me why?" Cole's hand drifted toward his gun, but stopped as more men appeared, townsmen Margaret recognized, all armed, all watching with hard eyes. Word had spread quickly. "No law against asking questions, Sheriff," Cole said carefully. "True enough, but there's law against what you got in mind. See, we don't hold with slavery in this territory, no matter what color the person or what paper you're carrying." "We're not slavers," one of the younger men protested. "We're looking for a murderer. Woman killed 2 men in cold blood, stole money and horses. We got papers." "I'll look at your papers," Daniels interrupted. "Down at the jail. You can leave your guns with my deputies." The tension stretched taut as fence wire. Margaret counted heartbeats, waiting for violence to erupt. But Cole was too smart for that. He saw the odds, the determined faces of the townsmen, the steady hands on gun butts. "We'll be moving on," he said finally. No need for trouble. Glad to hear it. Road north is real nice this time of year. South, too. East and west as well. Lots of choices. Long as they lead away from my town. The strangers filed out, boots heavy on the floorboards. Through the window, Margaret watched them mount up, saw Cole's eyes scanning the storefronts, searching. For one heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to lock with hers through the glass. Then they were riding away, dust rising behind them like bitter smoke. "They'll be back," Sheriff Daniels said quietly. "Men like that don't give up easy." Margaret finally found her voice. "I should leave. This isn't your fight." "Like hell," Henderson said firmly. "Pardon my language, ma'am, but you're one of us now. Jake Walsh's word is good enough for me, and he says you belong here." "I need to warn Jacob," Margaret said, already moving toward the door. "I'll ride with you," Daniels offered. "Those men might circle back." They rode hard for the ranch, Margaret's mind racing faster than the horses. She'd recognized Cole Harwick, but he'd shown no sign of recognizing her. 6 years had changed her, sun and wind weathering her face, hard work strengthening her body, and something else, something harder to define. She was no longer the terrified girl they'd branded. But would that be enough? Jacob met them in the yard, rifle in hand, having seen their approach. His face darkened as Daniels explained what had happened in town. "Where are the Wilson boys?" he asked. "Still watching the north pasture," Margaret said. "Jacob, if you say you should leave, I'll turn you over my knee like a child." Jacob interrupted, then flushed at his own words. Despite everything," Margaret felt a smile tug at her lips. "I was going to say I should start carrying the Derringer you gave me." "Oh, well, yes, good idea." Daniels cleared his throat. "I'll post a man at the road junction. Keep watch. But Jake, these aren't ordinary drifters. That one with the scar. I've seen his kind before. They'll come at night, most likely, and they won't care who gets hurt." After the sheriff left, Jacob and Margaret stood in the yard, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. She could see the worry in his eyes, the weight of what she'd brought to his door. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what? For surviving? For finding your way here?" Jacob shook his head. "Margaret, I've been half alive for 8 years, going through motions, tending this land like a grave. You brought life back to this place. To me, I'll be damned if I let anyone take that away." That night, they prepared. Jacob showed her where he kept extra ammunition, walked her through defensive positions around the house and barn. The Wilson boys rode in at dusk, grim-faced and ready. They'd seen the strangers' tracks, followed them to a camp about 5 miles north. "They're waiting for something," Sam Wilson said. "Or someone. My guess is they've sent word to others, planning to come in force." "Then we'd best be ready," Jacob said simply. They set up watches, 2 men at a time, rotating through the night. Margaret tried to sleep but couldn't, finally giving up and making coffee for the watchers. Around midnight, she found Jacob on the porch, rifle across his knees, staring out at the darkness. "Can't sleep either?" he asked as she handed him a cup. "Too much thinking." They sat in companionable silence, shoulders almost touching. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead. But Margaret couldn't shake the feeling of storm approaching. "I've been thinking too," Jacob said eventually, "about life, choices, chances we take or don't take." He set down his coffee, turning to face her. "Margaret, if we get through this, when we get through this, I want to ask you something, but it doesn't seem fair to ask when danger's hanging over us, might make you feel obligated." "Jacob," Margaret interrupted softly. "Ask." He took a breath, and in the starlight she could see vulnerability in his weathered features. "Would you consider staying, not as hired help, but as my wife? I know it's soon. Know you've had your fill of marriage, but—" "Yes," the word hung between them, simple and sure. Jacob blinked, as if he'd misheard. "Yes? Yes." Margaret found herself smiling despite everything. "But you should know what you're getting." A woman with a scarred arm and a price on her head isn't much of a bargain. You're everything, Jacob said fiercely. Everything I thought I'd never have again, joy and purpose and life. Margaret, that's what you are. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, as if she might break or flee. Margaret leaned into it, feeling something inside her chest crack open, not breaking, but making room for hope to grow. A shout from the barn shattered the moment. One of the Wilson boys had spotted movement. Jacob was on his feet instantly, rifle ready. Margaret grabbed the shotgun from beside the door, checking the loads. Could be them scouting, Jacob said quietly. Or could be coyotes. Either way, stay close to the house. But the night passed without incident, tension slowly easing as dawn approached. Whatever the watchers had seen, it hadn't been the beginning of an attack. Morning brought unexpected visitors. Sheriff Daniels with a federal marshal from Tucson and 3 soldiers from Fort Buchanan. The marshal, a grizzled man named Thompson, listened to Margaret's story with careful attention. I know about Charles Dutton's operation, he said when she finished. We've been hunting the remnants for 3 years. If these men are who you say, they're wanted for more than just what they did to you, ma'am. Murder, kidnapping, trading in stolen goods and stolen people. Then you'll help, Jacob asked. I'll do more than that. I'll deputize anyone willing to stand with us. These men have evaded justice too long. By noon, the ranch had become an armed camp. Neighbors had arrived, not just the Wilsons, but the Hendersons, the Martinez family, even old Swedish Lars from the furthest homestead. Men and women who understood that some fights were everyone's fights. Margaret moved among them, serving coffee, offering quiet thanks. These people who barely knew her were willing to risk everything to protect her. The brand on her arm seemed to throb, but for the first time, it felt less like a mark of shame and more like a battle scar, proof of what she'd survived to reach this moment. As the sun reached its zenith, a rider approached under a white flag. Margaret recognized him as one of Cole's younger men, nervous but trying to appear confident. Cole Harwick wants to talk, he announced. Just talk. Says he'll meet whoever's in charge, halfway between here and our camp. Marshal Thompson looked at Jacob, then at Margaret. Your choice, ma'am, but might be good to hear what he has to say. Margaret felt Jacob tense beside her, protective, but she'd spent 6 years running from these men. Perhaps it was time to face them. I'll go, she said quietly, but not alone. Damn right not alone, Jacob said immediately. In the end, it was decided. Margaret, Jacob, Marshal Thompson, and Sheriff Daniels would meet Cole and 3 of his men. The others would watch from a distance, ready if treachery showed itself. As Margaret prepared to ride out, she did something she hadn't done in 6 years. She rolled up her left sleeve, letting the scar show clearly in the bright afternoon sun. Jacob saw and nodded approval. Let them see, he said. Let them know it didn't break you. They rode out to meet their fate, Margaret's head high, the brand on her arm no longer hidden but displayed like a banner of survival. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself, Margaret Quinn, survivor, fighter, and soon-to-be wife of Jacob Walsh. The running was over. The standing had begun. The meeting place was a flat stretch of ground between 2 ancient cottonwoods, their leaves rustling in the afternoon breeze. Cole Harwick sat his horse with the easy arrogance of a man who'd never been held accountable for his sins. His eyes found Margaret immediately, lingering on her exposed arm where the brand showed dark against her skin. Well, he drawled. Little Maggie Dutton. Though I hear you go by Quinn now, trying to forget your husband. The man I killed wasn't my husband, Margaret said clearly. He was my captor, and you helped him. Cole's scarred mouth twisted. That's not how the law sees it. Got the marriage papers right here. He patted his vest pocket. Legal and binding, which makes you a widow who murdered her lawful husband and stole his property. Those papers won't hold water, Marshal Thompson interjected. Marriage by force ain't legal in this territory. Maybe not, Cole conceded. But she still shot Charles and Luther in cold blood. That's murder any way you slice it. Margaret felt Jacob tense beside her, but she placed a calming hand on his arm. This was her battle to fight. "Tell them why I shot them," she said, her voice carrying across the space between them. "Tell them what you were doing that night, what Luther was heating in the fire besides the branding iron." For the first time, Cole's confidence flickered. His men shifted uneasily in their saddles. "Go on," Margaret pressed. "Tell the marshal about the other women, the ones who didn't survive the branding. Tell him about Mary Littlefoot, who bled to death after Luther got creative with his marks. Tell him about Elena Vasquez, who threw herself down a mine shaft rather than be sold again." "Shut your mouth," Cole snarled, his hand moving toward his gun. "Tell them about the children," Margaret continued, her voice rising. "The Apache boys you sold to the copper mines, the Mexican girls sent to the brothels in California. Tell them—" Cole drew, but Jacob was faster. His rifle cracked once, and Cole's pistol went spinning from his hand. The man clutched his bleeding fingers, cursing viciously. "Next one goes through your head," Jacob said calmly. "Ladies talking." Marshal Thompson had his own gun out now, trained on Cole's men. "I think I've heard enough. Cole Harwick, you're under arrest for trafficking in human beings, conspiracy to commit murder, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the way back to Tucson." But Cole laughed, a harsh sound like breaking glass. "You think this is over? You got no idea how many of us there are. Charles had friends, powerful friends, men who profited from his business and won't take kindly to losing their supply chain. Then we'll arrest them too," Thompson said simply. "With what evidence? The word of a branded woman?" Cole's eyes glittered with malice. "Look at her arm. Marshal, she's marked goods. No jury in the territory will take her word over respectable businessmen." Margaret felt the old shame trying to rise. But then Jacob spoke, his voice deadly quiet. "That mark," he said, "is evidence of what you did to her. Every scar on her body is testimony to your crimes. And if any jury needs more proof than that, they can talk to the dozen witnesses back at my ranch who heard you just confess to knowing about murdered women and sold children." Cole's face went pale as he realized his mistake. In his anger, he'd admitted to knowledge of the crimes, implicating himself thoroughly. "There's something else," Margaret said, reaching into her saddlebag. She pulled out a leather journal, weathered and worn. "Charles kept records, names, dates, prices paid. I took it when I ran. Every transaction, every sale, every person you destroyed, it's all here." She'd carried it for 6 years, hoping someday to find someone who would listen, who would act. Marshal Thompson reached for the journal with something like reverence. "Ma'am," he said softly, "this is evidence enough to hang half the territory. Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Who would have believed me?" Margaret asked simply. "A runaway branded woman against wealthy men. I needed to be strong enough to stand up to them. I needed—" She glanced at Jacob. "I needed to find people who would stand with me." One of Cole's younger men suddenly spurred his horse, trying to flee. Sheriff Daniels's rope caught him neat as you please, yanking him from the saddle. The other two surrendered quickly after that, seeing the rifles trained on them from the watching neighbors. As the marshal's men bound the prisoners, Cole stared at Margaret with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "You'll never be free of that mark, never be more than what we made you." Jacob dismounted and walked slowly to where Cole sat trussed on the ground. The older man squatted down, speaking quietly but clearly. "That mark doesn't define her any more than my scars define me," he said. "But you're going to be defined by what you did for the rest of your short life. And when they hang you, and they will hang you, the last thing you'll see is all the people you hurt, standing free while you swing." They brought the prisoners back to the ranch, where the assembled neighbors cheered their capture. Margaret found herself surrounded by women who embraced her, men who tipped their hats respectfully, children who stared with awe at the woman who'd helped catch the bad men. Marshal Thompson commandeered the kitchen table to begin going through the journal, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "Ma'am, this is going to bring down some powerful people. You may need protection until the trials are over. She's got protection, Sam Wilson said firmly. Anyone wants to get to Mrs. Walsh will have to go through all of us. Mrs. Walsh? The marshal asked, raising an eyebrow. Margaret blushed. Not yet, but soon. Speaking of which, Jacob said, turning to face the assembled crowd. Since we've got most of the valley here, and a marshal to make it legal, seems like a good time to make an announcement. Miss Margaret Quinn has agreed to marry me, if she hasn't come to her senses yet. The cheer that went up could probably be heard in town. Margaret found herself laughing and crying at the same time as neighbor women started immediately planning the wedding, arguing about cakes and dresses and flowers. But she pulled away from the cheerful chaos. Needing a moment, she found herself at the corral, where Buttercup nickered a greeting. The mare lipped at her hair affectionately, and Margaret stroked the soft nose. "It's over," she whispered to the horse. "It's really over." "Not quite," Jacob said, joining her at the fence. "Still the trials, still the healing. But the running, yeah, that's done." Margaret looked at her exposed arm, the brand dark in the fading light. Without thinking, she'd rolled her sleeve down several times during the confrontation, but each time she'd rolled it back up. The mark was part of her story, but it wasn't her whole story. "It's ugly," she said softly. Jacob surprised her by rolling up his own sleeve, revealing a puckered scar that ran from wrist to elbow. "Barbed wire," he said. "Got tangled up trying to save a calf. Nearly bled out before Sarah found me." He rolled up his other sleeve, showing burn marks. "Barn fire, 10 years ago." He pointed to his forehead, where a thin white line ran into his hairline. "Bar fight in Tombstone when I was young and stupid." He took her scarred arm gently, running his thumb over the branded letters. "We're all marked by life, Margaret. Difference is, you survived something that would have killed most people, and you didn't let it make you cruel or bitter. That's not ugly. That's beautiful." She kissed him then, there by the corral with the horses as witnesses and the sunset painting everything gold. When they parted, she felt something fundamental had shifted. The shame wasn't gone entirely. Maybe it never would be, but it no longer owned her. That night, the ranch was full of life. The neighbor women had taken over Margaret's kitchen, producing a feast from seemingly thin air. Someone had brought a fiddle, and music spilled out into the darkness. Margaret found herself dancing, in Jacob's arms while their friends clapped and stomped. Marshal Thompson pulled her aside during a break in the music. "The Journal mentions a strongbox," he said quietly, "hidden somewhere on Dutton's old property. It might contain more evidence, maybe even money that belongs to victims' families." Margaret nodded. She'd always wondered about Charles's references to his insurance policy, the secret stash he'd bragged about when drunk. "I'll draw you a map," she offered. "Actually," Thompson said, "I'd like you to come with us when we search for it. Your testimony will be crucial in court, and having you there when we recover evidence will strengthen the case." The thought of returning to that place of nightmares made her stomach clench, but she nodded. No more running from the past. Later, as the party wound down and neighbors began the ride home, Margaret stood on the porch watching the stars. The brand on her arm ached. It always did when the weather changed, but tonight the pain seemed different. Less like a wound, more like a reminder. Jacob joined her, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "Regrets?" he asked. "No," Margaret said, surprising herself with the truth of it. "No regrets. If I hadn't gone through all that, I wouldn't have ended up here, wouldn't have found you." "Seems a high price to pay for my company," Jacob said lightly, but she could hear the emotion beneath. "Worth it," she said simply. Inside the house, Marshal Thompson was still working through the Journal, building his case. Tomorrow would bring challenges, the trip to the old Dutton place, the beginning of what would surely be a long legal process. There would be threats from the powerful men named in Charles's records, attempts to discredit her testimony, painful reliving of trauma in court. But tonight, she stood on the porch of her home. Home. What a word that was, with the man she loved beside her and the support of a community around her. The brand on her arm was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined her. "This mark isn't ink," she said quietly, echoing the words she'd been too afraid to speak for so long. But now, instead of shame, there was defiance, even pride. "It's proof that I survived, that I'm stronger than what they tried to make me." Jacob lifted her scarred arm and pressed his lips to the brand, gentle as a prayer. Tears ran down his weathered face, but his eyes were fierce with love and pride. "That's my girl," he whispered. "That's my brave, beautiful girl." They stood together as the night deepened, two scarred souls who'd found healing in each other. Tomorrow would bring its battles, but tonight there was peace. Tonight there was home. Tonight there was love strong enough to transform even the deepest wounds into badges of honor. The coyotes sang in the distance, their wild chorus no longer lonely but celebratory, and Margaret Quinn, soon to be Margaret Walsh, sang with them in her heart, a song of survival, of triumph, of love that conquers all. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and red when they came. Margaret was in the barn, tending to Buttercup, when she heard the thunder of hooves, too many, coming too fast. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the rhythm of pursuit, of men riding with deadly purpose. "Jacob!" she called, but he was already moving, rifle in hand, having heard the same warning in the approaching sound. They weren't Cole's men. Those were secure in the Tucson jail awaiting trial. These were the others Charles had written about, the respectable businessmen who'd profited from human misery. Cole must have gotten word out before his capture. "Get to the house," Jacob ordered. But Margaret was already running for her own rifle. She'd learned never to be helpless again. The riders swept into the yard like a plague of locusts. 8 men, all armed, led by a figure Margaret recognized with a sick lurch of her stomach. Harrison Blackwood, mine owner and territorial politician, a man whose fortune had been built on the backs of the people Charles had sold him. "Walsh," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying the authority of wealth and position. "We've come for the woman. Hand her over, and this ends peacefully." Jacob stepped onto the porch, rifle casual in his hands but ready. "Only way anyone leaves my land is of their own free will, Blackwood, and the lady's made her choice clear. That woman has property belonging to me," Blackwood said coldly. "A journal taken from my business partner. I have legal claim. Your claims are worth less than dust." Marshal Thompson's voice rang out from the side of the house. He stepped into view, badge glinting, flanked by Sheriff Daniels. They'd stayed the night, expecting something like this. "Harrison Blackwood, I'm arresting you for conspiracy to engage in human trafficking." Blackwood laughed, an ugly sound. "You think your tin badge means anything against my lawyers? Marshal, I own judges from here to San Francisco." "Maybe," Thompson agreed. "But you don't own the federal government? And they take a dim view of slavery, especially after we fought a war over it." The tension stretched taut, each side measuring the other. Margaret counted guns, calculated angles, 8 of them. But she could see movement in the windows of the house. Mrs. Henderson and her eldest daughter, both handy with rifles. The Wilson boys would have heard the commotion, would be coming. But Blackwood had one card left to play. "Luther didn't die quick, you know," he said conversationally, his eyes finding Margaret. "Gut shot. Took him 3 days. He spent them cursing your name, swearing what he'd do if he found you." Blackwood smiled coldly. "His brother Thomas took it personal. That's him there, on the bay horse." Margaret looked and felt her heart skip. The man on the bay had Luther's face, younger and unmarked by cruelty, but with the same dead eyes. Thomas Luther, who'd been away when she'd made her escape, who'd spent 6 years hunting for her. "You murdered my brother," Thomas said, his voice flat and terrible. "Shot him down like a dog." "Your brother was worse than a dog," Margaret heard herself say, stepping out from the barn's shadow. "Dogs don't torture people for sport. Dogs don't sell children." "Lying witch," Thomas snarled. "Going for his gun." The evening exploded in gunfire. Margaret dove behind the water trough as bullets whined overhead. She came up shooting, years of practice steadying her aim. Her shot took one of Blackwood's men in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle. Jacob had taken cover behind a porch pillar, his rifle speaking in measured cracks. Marshal Thompson and Sheriff Daniels fired from the house corner, their experience showing in their calm efficiency. But they were outnumbered, and Blackwood's men were spreading out, trying to flank them. Margaret saw two riders breaking left, heading for the back of the house where they could catch the defenders in crossfire. She ran, keeping low, using the corral fence for cover. Buttercup and the other horses were screaming, terrified by the gunfire. Margaret vaulted the fence, using the milling animals as concealment, coming up behind the flanking riders. Her first shot was perfect, knocking one man from his saddle. The second rider wheeled, bringing his pistol around, but Margaret was already moving. She felt the bullet tug at her sleeve as she fired, saw him clutch his chest and topple. The battle raged in the dying light, muzzle flashes like deadly fireflies. Margaret made it back to Jacob's position, sliding in beside him behind an overturned wagon. "You hurt?" he asked, not taking his eyes off the fight. "No, but they're trying to get around us." "Not for long," Jacob said grimly. And indeed, the thunder of more hooves announced the arrival of the Wilson clan, whooping like Comanches as they charged into the fray. The odds suddenly even. Blackwood's men began to waver. That's when Margaret saw Thomas Luther break from cover, running straight for her position, his face twisted with killing rage. His gun was empty. She could hear the hammer clicking on spent chambers. But he had a knife in his hand, the blade catching the last rays of sunlight. Jacob tried to swing his rifle around, but Thomas was too close, too fast. He crashed into Margaret, bearing her to the ground, the knife descending in a silver arc. She caught his wrist with her left hand, her scarred arm, the one she'd protected and hidden for so long. The branded muscle, strengthened by years of compensating for its injury, held firm. They rolled in the dust, fighting for control of the blade. "You killed him!" Thomas screamed, spittle flying. "He was my brother! He was a monster!" Margaret gasped back, using her knee to drive into his ribs. "Just like you!" The knife wavered between them, Thomas bearing down with all his weight. Margaret felt her strength failing, the blade inching closer to her throat. Then Jacob was there, his rifle butt crashing into Thomas's skull with a sound like a melon dropping. Thomas collapsed, the knife spinning harmlessly away. Margaret scrambled back, gasping, as Jacob hauled the unconscious man aside. "I told you," Jacob said, breathing hard. "You're not alone anymore." The gunfire was dying down. Two of Blackwood's men were down and not moving. 3 more had surrendered, throwing down their weapons as the Wilson boys closed in. Blackwood himself sat his horse in the middle of the yard, looking around at his failed ambush with the expression of a man watching his world collapse. "It's over, Blackwood," Marshal Thompson called out. "Come down from there, nice and easy." But Blackwood's eyes found Margaret, and in them she saw the same madness that had driven Charles, the same belief that people could be owned, branded, broken. "You think you've won?" he said, his cultured voice cracking. "You're marked, woman, branded like the property you are. That will never change. You'll never be more than—" The shot came from behind Blackwood. He jerked, looking down in surprise at the spreading red stain on his vest, then toppled slowly from his saddle. Everyone turned to see who had fired. At the edge of the yard sat a lone rider, rifle still smoking. The man was young, perhaps 30, with Jacob's eyes and jawline. "Thomas," Jacob whispered, and Margaret realized she was looking at his lost son. Thomas Walsh lowered his rifle, his face grim. "Man was reaching for a hideout gun," he said simply. "Couldn't let him shoot my father." His eyes moved to Margaret. "Or the woman who's going to be my mother." Later, they would learn that Thomas had been riding for 3 days, having heard in California about his father's engagement. He'd been coming home to make amends, to bridge the years of silence, when he'd seen the riders approaching the ranch with violent intent. But in that moment, in the swirling gun smoke and fading light, all that mattered was a son's choice to protect his family. Jacob dismounted slowly, as if afraid sudden movement might make Thomas vanish like smoke. Father and son faced each other across the years and pain. And then Thomas swung down from his horse. "I'm sorry, Pa," he said simply. "For everything." Jacob crossed the space between them in 3 strides, pulling his son into an embrace that spoke louder than any words. Margaret saw tears on both faces, years of regret and loneliness washing away in that moment of reconciliation. The aftermath was swift. Marshal Thompson arrested the survivors, including the unconscious Thomas Luther. The dead were laid out and covered, awaiting the undertaker from town. Margaret found herself standing over Blackwood's body, waiting to feel something. Triumph, satisfaction, even relief. Instead, she felt only tired. "It's done," Sheriff Daniels said, coming to stand beside her. "With Blackwood dead and his men facing the gallows, that trafficking ring is finished. You did that, ma'am. You stood up when it mattered." Margaret looked at her left arm. In the fight, her sleeve had been torn away, the brand exposed for all to see, but none of the men around her looked at it with disgust or judgment. They saw only another scar earned in battle, proof of survival against evil. "Mrs." Henderson appeared with water and bandages, clucking over the various minor wounds the defenders had sustained. As she wrapped a graze on Margaret's arm, her right arm, ironically, the older woman spoke quietly. "My sister was taken by men like that, years ago. Never found her. What you did today, standing up to them, you fought for all of us who couldn't fight back then." As full dark fell, the yard filled with neighbors drawn by the gunfire. They came ready to fight but stayed to help, clearing away the signs of battle, tending the wounded, preparing food for the defenders. It was frontier justice at its best, a community protecting its own. Thomas Walsh worked alongside the others, slowly finding his place again in the world he'd fled. Margaret watched him talking quietly with Jacob, saw the careful rebuilding of trust between them, and felt her heart ease. The family Jacob had lost was returning, different but whole. "Miss Margaret," Thomas approached her as she stood watching the stars appear. "I owe you an apology, and my thanks." "For what?" "The apology is for the years I left Pa alone. I can see now what my leaving cost him." Thomas paused, choosing his words carefully. "The thanks is for bringing him back to life. I heard in town how he'd been these past years, just existing, not living. You changed that." "He changed it for me too," Margaret said softly. Thomas nodded, then surprised her by taking her scarred arm gently, examining the brand with no revulsion. "Pa told me what this means, what you survived. I've seen men break under far less. You're stronger than any of us." "I had to be," Margaret said simply. "No," Thomas corrected. "You chose to be. That's different. That's everything." Later that night, after statements were given and the wounded tended, after the bodies were removed and the blood washed from the yard, Margaret found herself alone with Jacob on the porch. Thomas was in the house, sleeping in his old room for the first time in over a decade. "Hell of a day," Jacob said, pulling her close. "Language," Margaret chided gently, but she was smiling. "Think it's allowed, considering—" He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You saved us all today. Your quick thinking, your courage. We saved each other." Margaret corrected. "That's what families do." "Family," Jacob repeated, wonder in his voice. "This morning it was just us. Now you have your son back. Now I have everything," Jacob said firmly. "A son returned, a bride who can outshoot half the territory, and a future I'd stopped believing in." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds returning to normal, crickets and owl calls replacing gunfire. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. "The trials will be hard," Margaret said eventually. "Testifying, reliving it all. We'll face them together," Jacob promised. "You, me, Thomas, all of us who believe in justice." Margaret touched the brand on her arm, no longer hidden, no longer defining her except as proof of her strength. "This mark is in ink," she said, the words coming easier now. It's history, my history, and I won't hide from it anymore. Jacob kissed her then, under the vast Nevada sky. While inside the house his sons slept, and around them the land held them safe. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, trials and testimony, the slow work of healing and building a new family. But tonight, evil had been faced and defeated. Tonight, love had proven stronger than hate. The coyotes sang their ancient song across the valley, and Margaret listened with new ears, not a lament for what was lost, but a celebration of what survived. She was marked, yes, but not broken, branded, but not owned. She was Margaret Quinn, soon to be Margaret Walsh. She was free. Dawn broke golden over the grassland after the storm, painting the world new. Margaret stood on the porch of the Walsh Ranch, breathing in air that smelled of sage and rain-washed earth. The violence of yesterday seemed like a distant nightmare in this morning light, though the churned earth of the yard testified to its reality. Jacob emerged from the barn where he'd been checking on the horses, still spooked from the gunfire. His son Thomas was with him, the two men moving with a careful choreography of people relearning each other's rhythms, watching them. Margaret felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the rising sun. "Horses are settling," Jacob reported, climbing the porch steps. "That mare of yours wouldn't let anyone but Thomas near her, though seems you're not the only one he's charmed." Thomas flushed slightly. "Just have a way with horses. Like Pa taught me, even if I forgot it for a while." The three of them stood together, a family still finding its shape. In the weeks since the shootout, they'd established new routines. Thomas had thrown himself into ranch work with the dedication of a man making amends. The trial had concluded swiftly, the evidence in Charles's journal too damning for even bought judges to ignore. The trafficking ring was broken, its surviving members facing justice. "Neighbors are coming today," Margaret reminded them. "For the celebration, our wedding celebration," Jacob corrected, pulling her close. "Still can't quite believe you went through with it." They'd married 3 days ago in a simple ceremony, Marshall Thompson officiating before he returned to Tucson with his prisoners. Margaret had worn her best dress, sleeves rolled up to show the brand proudly, no longer hiding what she'd survived. The whole valley had turned out, filling the yard with joy instead of violence. "Best decision I ever made," Margaret said, meaning it wholly. Cars began arriving by mid-morning, wagons and riders streaming in from across the valley. The women had organized everything, turning the ranch into a festival ground. Tables groaned under food. Children ran laughing between the buildings. And Sam Wilson had brought his fiddle. Margaret moved through it all in a kind of wonder. 6 months ago, she'd been alone, running, certain she'd never know peace or belonging. Now she had a husband who saw her strength instead of her scars, a son who'd chosen to come home, and a community that had stood with her against evil. "Mrs. Walsh." Young Annie Henderson ran up, grabbing Margaret's hand. "Mama says you're going to teach us to shoot. Will you really?" "If your parents approve," Margaret said, smiling at the girl's enthusiasm. "Every woman should know how to protect herself." Sheriff Daniels approached, tipping his hat. "Ma'am, Jake, wanted to let you know, got word from Tucson. Thomas Luther was convicted. Life sentence, hard labor. He won't be troubling anyone again." Margaret nodded, feeling the last shadow of fear lift from her shoulders. "Thank you, Sheriff, for everything." "Thank you," Daniels countered. "That journal you provided has led to arrests across 3 territories. A lot of people are free today because you had the courage to speak up." As the afternoon wore on, Margaret found herself by the corral with several of the valley's women. They'd formed an informal circle, sharing stories and laughter. Mrs. Martinez had rolled up her sleeve to show an old burn scar from a kitchen fire. Mrs. Henderson displayed the marks on her hands from years of hard work. "We all carry our histories," said Mrs. Wilson, who'd lost 2 fingers to a farming accident. "Difference is, some are visible, some aren't, but they all tell the story of who we are." Margaret looked at these women, strong, capable, marked by life but not diminished by it, and felt tears prick her eyes. They'd made room for her among them, seeing past the brand to the person beneath. As evening approached, Jacob called for attention. He stood with Thomas at his side, Margaret joining them as the crowd gathered. "Want to thank you all for coming," Jacob began, his voice carrying across the yard. "For standing with us when trouble came, for celebrating with us now that it's past. This ranch has been many things over the years. A dream, a burden, a lonely refuge. But today, with all of you here, it's what it was always meant to be. A home. To home!" someone shouted, and the cry was taken up by many voices. Thomas stepped forward, still uncomfortable with attention but determined. "I left this place angry and foolish," he said. "Thought I knew better than the man who built it. Thought I was too good for the life he offered. I was wrong." He looked at Margaret. "But sometimes being wrong leads you right. My foolishness took me away, but it also brought me back when I was needed. And it let me see what I'd been too blind to notice before, that this land, these people, this life, it's worth fighting for." The music started up again as darkness fell, lanterns casting warm pools of light. Margaret danced with Jacob, with Thomas, with neighbors who'd become family. Her scarred arm was bare to the evening air, the brand visible to all, and she felt no shame, only pride in what she'd survived, joy in what she'd found. Late in the evening, she noticed a stranger at the edge of the gathering, a young woman, travel-worn and wary, watching the celebration with hungry eyes. Margaret recognized the look, the careful way the woman kept her back to walls, the long sleeves despite the warm night. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to spook her. "Welcome," she said simply. "Are you hungry? There's plenty of food." The woman's eyes darted nervously. I heard about what happened here, about the trial, about a woman who stood up to—" She trailed off, unable to finish. "About a woman who survived," Margaret said gently. "Just like you're surviving." The stranger's eyes filled with tears. "They said you were marked, that you didn't hide it anymore." In answer, Margaret rolled up her sleeve fully, displaying the brand in the lantern light. "This mark isn't ink," she said, the words coming easily now. "It's proof of what I overcame, proof that they couldn't break me, no matter how they tried." The young woman slowly, carefully, rolled up her own sleeve, a different mark, but the same story written in scar tissue. "I've been running for 2 years," she whispered. "Then maybe it's time to stop." Margaret suggested, "There's work here if you want it. Good people who judge by character, not by marks, a place to heal, to build something new." Hope dawned in the stranger's eyes like sunrise after a long night. Margaret led her to the food tables, introduced her simply as a friend who's traveled far. No questions were asked, only welcome offered. The valley had learned to recognize survivors, to make room for healing. As the celebration wound down and families began the journey home, Margaret stood with her husband and son, watching the lanterns bob away into the darkness like earthbound stars. The stranger, who'd shyly given her name as Ruth, was in the house, fed and safe, already befriended by Mrs. Henderson's daughters. "Another wounded bird," Jacob said softly, but his tone was approving. "Another survivor," Margaret corrected. "Another fighter who needs a place to rest." "Good thing we've got room," Thomas added. "Ranch this size needs more hands anyway." They stood together in the quiet that followed celebration. 3 people who'd found their way through loss and pain to this moment of peace. The land stretched around them, vast and accepting, ready for whatever came next. Margaret touched the brand on her arm one more time, then let her sleeve fall. It was part of her, would always be part of her. But it was no longer her secret shame or her defining feature. It was simply one thread in the tapestry of her life. A dark thread. Yes, but one that made the bright threads shine all the more beautiful by contrast. "Ready to go in?" Jacob asked. Margaret looked up at the stars, then at the man who'd seen her truly and loved her completely, at the son who'd chosen family over pride, at the house that had become home. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it in every possible way. They walked inside together, leaving the door open for the cool night breeze. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Running a ranch always did. There would be other survivors finding their way to their door, other battles to fight for justice and dignity. But tonight, there was peace. Tonight, there was family. Tonight, there was home. The coyotes sang in the distance, their wild music a reminder that some things could never be tamed or broken. Margaret smiled, knowing she was one of them, marked but not mastered, branded but beautifully, eternally free. Thank you all for listening to this story. I'd love to hear where you're enjoying this tale, whether you're listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps under the same vast skies that witnessed Margaret's journey. Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and reactions make this community special, just like the neighbors who stood by Margaret and Jacob. Let's keep these powerful stories of survival and redemption alive together.